Ladies and gentlemen, people-pleasing seems harmless at first glance. It can look like love, like humility, like a good heart trying to serve others. But when you peel back the layers, often what you find underneath is not genuine love, but a deep-rooted fear. The truth is, people-pleasing is not about giving out of abundance. It is about performing out of insecurity. It is about being driven by the fear of rejection. We say yes when we want to say no, not because our heart is overflowing with generosity, but because we are terrified that if we disappoint them, they might not like us anymore. It is not kindness that drives us. It is the fear of being left out, overlooked, or unloved. The scripture says in Proverbs 29:25 that the fear of man brings a snare. A snare is a trap, something that looks harmless until it locks you down and takes your freedom. That is what people-pleasing does to the soul. You think you are just trying to keep the peace, but in reality, you are building a prison around yourself, brick by brick, every time you let fear dictate your choices. You are not living in the freedom of Christ. You are living in the bondage of what others might think about you. Think about how this plays out in daily life. You are at work and your boss asks you to stay late even though you have a family commitment. Instead of speaking up, you say yes, because deep down you fear being seen as lazy or uncommitted. A friend asks for a favor you do not have the time or energy for, but you agree anyway because you are afraid that if you decline, they might not value you as much. Even in relationships, you hide your real thoughts and feelings because you fear that showing your true self will push someone away. Every time you choose fear over truth, you reinforce the lie that your worth comes from people's approval rather than God's acceptance. What makes this trap so dangerous is that it often disguises itself as virtue. People will praise you for being so helpful, so dependable, so accommodating. On the outside, you look like the nicest person in the room. But on the inside, you might be anxious, resentful, and exhausted. That is the danger of people-pleasing. It masquerades as selflessness, but is fueled by self-preservation. It is not that you love people too much. It is that you love rejection too little. You cannot stand the idea of being on the outside, so you bend yourself until you break just to stay on the inside. This fear becomes a kind of addiction. You get a small rush of relief every time someone approves of you, every time they smile because you said yes, every time they compliment you for being so accommodating. But like any addiction, the high doesn't last. The approval fades quickly, and then you are left needing another hit of affirmation to feel secure. It is a cycle that never ends because human approval was never meant to be your foundation in the first place. When you live this way long enough, you start to lose yourself. You no longer know what you want, what you need, or even who you are. Your life becomes an endless performance, auditioning for roles in other people's stories, while your own God-given story sits on the shelf. You trade authenticity for acceptance, but the trade leaves you empty. And the enemy loves this because as long as you are trapped in the fear of rejection, you will never step into the boldness of your calling. But here's the reality, no matter how much you try, you will never keep everyone happy. It is impossible. People's expectations are constantly shifting, and no matter how much you bend, someone will still think you are not enough. The very thing you are afraid of, rejection, cannot be avoided, even if you give your whole life trying. So the fear that drives people-pleasing is not only exhausting, it is pointless. The fear of rejection behind people-pleasing robs you of the confidence God has given you. It keeps you silent when you should speak. It keeps you stuck when you should move. It keeps you small when God has called you to live boldly. And until you recognize that the root is not love but fear, you will never break free. The freedom comes when you realize that the fear of rejection is a snare, and the only way out of the trap is to stop letting man's opinion be your master. Because the truth is, you cannot live fully for God if you are constantly living in fear of people approval. Addiction is subtle, but it is powerful. On the surface, it doesn't look like a problem because everyone enjoys being appreciated, noticed, and valued. But when the need for approval becomes the foundation of your decisions, it stops being a blessing and starts being a prison. You begin to live not out of conviction, but out of compulsion, constantly adjusting yourself to fit into the mold of what other people expect. That kind of living looks like humility, but in reality, it becomes bondage. When you live for approval, you hand other people the remote control to your emotions. Their opinion determines your mood. Their compliments lift you up, but their silence drags you down. Their acceptance makes you feel secure, but their disapproval makes you feel like you are nothing. That is not freedom, that is slavery. And the chains are invisible because they are built out of praise and validation. People cheer for you, but every clap is another link in the chain if you are depending on it for your worth. Think about how many times you have said yes when everything inside of you wanted to say no. You were tired, you were stretched thin, you needed rest, but you couldn't bring yourself to disappoint someone. That is not generosity, that is fear. Approval addiction makes you believe that your value is tied to your usefulness, so you run yourself into the ground trying to stay worthy in the eyes of others. You overcommit, overextend, and overperform because you are terrified of what might happen if you stop. The problem with this addiction is that it is never satisfied. Approval is fleeting. Today, they cheer. Tomorrow, they criticize. One moment they are for you, the next moment they forget you. The same crowd that shouted Hosanna to Jesus when he entered Jerusalem shouted, "Crucify him," just days later. If Jesus himself experienced the fickleness of human approval, What makes us think we can build our lives on it? Living for applause is like trying to hold water in your hands. It slips away no matter how tight you grip. When you fall into this cycle, you start confusing acceptance with identity. You begin to believe that who you are is only as good as what people think of you. That is why rejection feels like death to someone who is addicted to approval. It doesn't just hurt their feelings, it shakes the core of their existence. But your identity was never meant to be established in the opinions of people. God had already spoken who you are long before anyone else got a vote. You are his child, chosen, loved, accepted, and secure. That truth is unshakable, but you will never experience it if you keep searching for security in the unstable approval of people. Approval addiction also distorts your motives. You start doing good things for the wrong reasons. You give, but not from love. You give to be noticed. You serve, but not because you care. You serve so they'll think highly of you. You say the right things not because you believe them, but because you know they will earn you applause. On the outside, it looks holy, but on the inside, it is hollow. Jesus warned about this in Matthew 6 when he said, don't practice your righteousness to be seen by others, because if you do, you already have your reward. Living for applause robs you of eternal reward and leaves you empty. And the weight of this bondage is crushing. You cannot rest because you are always on stage. You cannot be authentic because you are always editing yourself to keep the crowd happy. You cannot be bold in your calling because you are terrified of offending someone. Your whole life becomes about performing instead of living. That is why it feels like a prison. You are not free to be who God made you to be because you are enslaved to who others expect you to be. The trap of approval addiction is that it promises connection but delivers isolation. Because the more you people please, the less people actually know the real you. They only know the version of you that is filtered and edited for their comfort. So you end up surrounded by people but still lonely, applauded but still insecure, admired but still unknown. That is the cruel irony of approval addiction. It gives you what you crave on the surface while stealing what you truly need underneath. God never intended for your worth to be dependent on the shifting tides of people's opinions. He intended for your worth to be anchored in his unchanging love. Until you break free from the prison of approval, you will always be chasing after something that can never satisfy. The applause of man may feel sweet in the moment, but it was never meant to be the air you breathe. The only approval that can set you free is the one you already have from your Father in heaven. And when you receive that, the chains of people pleasing begin to break. Jesus himself experienced rejection, and that truth should change the way we see our own fear of it. If anyone ever had the credentials to be universally accepted, it was him. He healed the sick, raised the dead, fed the hungry, and spoke with wisdom that astonished even his critics. Yet the very people he came to save mocked him, questioned him, betrayed him, and ultimately crucified him. If the perfect Son of God could not escape rejection, why do we spend so much of our lives trying to avoid it? Rejection is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that you are walking the same path your Savior walked. We often believe the lie that if we just do enough good, if we just keep everyone happy, then we will avoid rejection. But the life of Jesus proves the opposite. He loved perfectly, yet people still walked away. He spoke truth, yet people still argued with him. He poured himself out, yet people still chose to turn their backs. That means rejection is not evidence that something is wrong with you. It might be confirmation that you are living aligned with God's calling. One of the reasons rejection hurts so deeply is because it feels personal. When someone excludes you, criticizes you, or abandons you, it shakes the sense of belonging we all crave. But if you look at the ministry of Jesus, rejection was never the final word. Every time people pushed him away, it redirected him toward the Father's plan. The rejection in Nazareth, where his own hometown refused to believe in him, pushed him to expand his ministry to other regions. The rejection of religious leaders opened the door for him to reach people who had been overlooked and excluded. Even the ultimate rejection, the cross, became the very place where salvation was accomplished. What looked like rejection from man was redemption from God. Understanding that truth changes how you see rejection in your own life. Instead of interpreting it as proof that you are not good enough, you can begin to see it as redirection. That relationship that ended, that job that didn't work out, that opportunity that slipped away, maybe it wasn't meant to define you. Maybe it was God's way of clearing the path so you could walk into something greater. The fear of rejection loses its grip when you realize rejection is often protection. When you make peace with the fact that rejection is unavoidable, you also free yourself from the exhausting performance of trying to keep everyone happy. If Jesus, who embodied perfect love, still encountered rejection, then you cannot possibly avoid it by people pleasing. The goal isn't to eliminate rejection, it's to stop letting the fear of it control your life. Once you accept that rejection is a part of the journey, you begin to live bolder, speak truth clearer, and step into opportunities with courage. Another thing we see in the example of Jesus is that rejection doesn't diminish identity. When the Pharisees questioned him, when the crowds turned against him, when even his disciples abandoned him, he never once forgot who he was. He never once doubted his Father's affirmation. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. That voice from heaven anchored him through every voice of rejection on earth. The same is true for you. People's opinions may shift, relationships may falter, But God's declaration over your life never changes. You are his child, chosen and loved. Their rejection cannot rewrite his acceptance. Rejection also has a refining effect. It strips away the need for constant validation and forces you to root your identity in something deeper. If everyone always accepted you, you might never learn how to anchor yourself in God's love. It is often through the sting of rejection that you discover the strength of his embrace. That moment when you feel most unwanted by people can be the very moment you sense most clearly how wanted you are by God. The fear of rejection will keep you silent when you should speak truth, passive when you should step forward, and small when you should rise in boldness. But once you see that even Jesus faced rejection and turned it into purpose, you realize rejection doesn't have the power to disqualify you. It only has the power to redirect you toward the greater calling God has placed on your life. And when you begin to see rejection through that lens, it loses its power to control you because you know the final word belongs not to those who rejected you, but to the God who has already accepted you. Rejection is one of the most painful experiences a person can face. But when you look at it through the lens of faith, it often carries a hidden purpose. What feels like rejection from people can sometimes be protection or redirection from God. Closed doors sting in the moment, but they often serve as divine detours steering us towards something better. We rarely see it in real time, but many of the disappointments we cry over today are the very things that prepare us for the breakthroughs of tomorrow. Think about how many times in Scripture rejection led to something greater. Joseph was rejected by his own brothers, sold into slavery, and thrown into prison. From the outside, it looked like his life was collapsing. But every rejection was actually positioning him for his ultimate role as second in command in Egypt, saving countless lives. David was overlooked when Samuel came to anoint a king. His father didn't even call him in from the field. Yet the rejection of man did not stop the selection of God, and David stepped into the destiny that had been reserved for him all along. Even Paul faced rejection from religious leaders, but that rejection propelled him to carry the gospel to the Gentiles, opening the door for millions to know Christ. Rejection in the moment often feels like an ending, but with God it is usually the beginning of something new. The reason rejection feels so devastating is because we interpret it as a statement about our worth. When someone turns away, when a job doesn't open, when a relationship falls apart, we assume it means we were not enough. But more often than not, it means God has something else in mind. A door that closes may be shutting out danger we cannot see. A person who leaves may be making space for someone who will value us more deeply. An opportunity that falls through may be saving us from stepping into a place we were never meant to be. Rejection may hurt, but it is not always a loss. It is sometimes protection. There is also redirection in rejection. Sometimes God allows something to fall apart because we would never move on our own. We get comfortable in routines, in relationships, in environments that no longer serve our purpose. We cling to what is familiar, even when it is unhealthy, because the fear of change feels worse than the pain of staying. Rejection forces movement. It disrupts what is stagnant. It pushes us out of comfort zones and into new seasons we would have resisted otherwise. What feels like being pushed out is often God pulling us forward. Rejection also clarifies vision. When a door closes, it makes you evaluate what you truly want and who you truly are. Sometimes the reason we face rejection is because we are trying to live in spaces that don't align with our identity. That rejection redirects us toward places where our gifts can flourish. Without the rejection, we would keep pouring energy into dead soil, expecting fruit where none was ever meant to grow. God uses rejection to redirect us to fertile ground. And while rejection hurts in the moment, it produces resilience. Every no you face builds a strength that prepares you for the yes that is coming. If everything opened easily, you would never develop the endurance you need for greater opportunities. The process of being turned away teaches you how to stand firm, how to trust deeper, and how to lean on God instead of people. That growth is not wasted. It is preparation for a higher purpose. Even the ultimate act of rejection, the cross, was transformed into redemption. Jesus was despised, mocked, abandoned, and crucified. What looked like the final rejection became the foundation of salvation. If God can take the greatest rejection in history and turn it into the greatest victory, he can certainly take the rejections in your life and use them for something greater. Rejection is never easy, but it does not have to define you. Instead of letting it convince you that you are not worthy, see it as a sign that God is redirecting your steps. Closed doors, lost opportunities, and broken relationships are not the end of your story. They are often the necessary shifts to align you with your destiny. The fear of rejection loses its power when you begin to trust that every no can be God's way of preparing you for a bigger yes. When you live for people's approval, you are never truly free. You are constantly measuring yourself against shifting expectations, and your sense of worth rises and falls with the opinions of others. One compliment lifts you up, but one criticism tears you down. That kind of life is exhausting because it makes your identity dependent on something fragile and unstable. God offers a better way. When you anchor yourself in his acceptance, you step into a freedom that no one can take away. His love is constant, unconditional, and secure, and when you build your life on that foundation, you no longer need to chase the fleeting approval of people. The difference between living for people's approval and living from God's acceptance is like the difference between renting a house and owning one. When you rent, you always feel like you are at the mercy of someone else's decisions. You cannot rest fully because at any moment the landlord could raise the rent or change the terms. That is how it feels when you live for people's approval. Your peace is always temporary, always dependent on someone else. But when you own, you are secure. The house is yours and no one can take it away. God's acceptance is ownership. He has already claimed you, secured you, and established your worth, and nothing anyone else says can change that. One of the most liberating truths in Scripture is that God's love is not performance-based. People love conditionally. They love you when you succeed, when you please them, when you meet their expectations. But the moment you fall short, that approval can disappear. God's love is not like that. Romans 8 reminds us that nothing can separate us from the love of Christ, not trouble, not failure, not rejection, not even our own mistakes. When you realize that you are fully accepted by God, you no longer have to beg for scraps of affirmation from people who may or may not value you consistently. Living for God's acceptance also gives you courage. People-pleasing makes you timid because you are always afraid of saying the wrong thing or upsetting someone. But when you know God has already approved you, you can step into boldness. You can speak the truth even if it offends. You can make decisions based on conviction rather than convenience. And you can walk into opportunities without being paralyzed by the fear of what others will think. Confidence is not arrogance. It is clarity that comes from knowing who you belong to. When your worth is rooted in God's acceptance, you also experience peace. People-pleasing is filled with anxiety because you are constantly worried about whether you are doing enough, being enough, or fitting in enough. But God's love gives rest. It tells you that you are enough, not because you are perfect, but because you are His. You do not have to prove yourself every day to maintain His favor. It is already yours. That peace allows you to let go of the endless striving and step into the rhythm of grace. Another powerful shift happens when you stop living for approval and start living from acceptance. You become more authentic. People-pleasing forces you to wear masks to hide parts of yourself that others might not like. But when you are secure in God's love, you can be honest about your flaws, your struggles, and your limitations, because you know those things do not disqualify you from His acceptance. Authenticity is attractive because people can sense when someone is real. Ironically, the more secure you are in God's love, the more people respect and trust you, even if you are not trying to please them. The freedom of living for God's acceptance also protects you from manipulation. When you crave approval, you are vulnerable to anyone who can withhold it. People can control you simply by threatening rejection. But when you are already grounded in the acceptance of God, their opinions lose power over you. You are no longer swayed by every voice because you are anchored to the only voice that truly matters. That doesn't mean you stop caring about people. It just means you stop being controlled by them. Ultimately, this shift is about identity. You cannot live a life of purpose if your identity is constantly being rewritten by others. But when you know that God has called you His child, chosen and beloved, your identity is unshackable. That truth allows you to step into everything He has for you without fear. You no longer need the applause of people to validate you because you already have the affirmation of your Father in heaven. And that is the kind of freedom that turns exhaustion into joy, striving into peace, and insecurity into confidence. Authenticity is one of the greatest gifts you can give to yourself and to the world, but it is often the first thing sacrificed when you are addicted to approval. The desire to be liked makes you edit yourself, trim your edges, and filter your true identity until what people see is only a shadow of who you really are. But God did not create you to be a copy of someone else's expectations. He created you with unique gifts, a distinct voice, and a specific purpose. Choosing authenticity over approval is not easy, but it is the only way to live in the fullness of who you were called to be. When you are driven by the need to be liked, you become a chameleon. You change your colors to fit the crowd. Around one group, you speak one way. Around another, you tone yourself down. Slowly, you begin to lose sight of who you actually are. You are so focused on performing that you forget your own preferences, passions, and convictions. The tragedy of people pleasing is that you might win the approval of others, but you lose yourself in the process. Jesus put it plainly when He asked, "What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul?" Approval feels like gain in the moment, but authenticity is what keeps your soul intact. Authenticity may cost you popularity, but it will give you peace. The truth is, not everyone will like you, no matter how much you try. People's opinions are too diverse, too unpredictable, and too conditional to ever please them all. Sooner or later, you will disappoint someone. If rejection is inevitable, why waste your life editing yourself for the sake of temporary approval? When you embrace authenticity, you accept that some people will misunderstand you, some will judge you, and some will even reject you. But the people who truly value you will be drawn to the real you, not the performance you put on. Authenticity filters out relationships built on convenience and leaves you with relationships built on truth. Another reason authenticity is more powerful than approval is because it aligns with God's design. He did not call you to live as a watered-down version of yourself. The gifts He placed in you, the personality He gave you, the passions He stirred in you, they are intentional. Hiding them to keep others comfortable is not humility, it is disobedience. When you live authentically, you honor the Creator by reflecting the unique way He made you. Your authenticity is an act of worship because it says, I trust that who you made me to be is enough. Authenticity also unlocks influence. People may be impressed by your performance, but they are inspired by your authenticity. What reaches the heart is not perfection, but honesty. When you are willing to share your struggles, your doubts, your failures, people see themselves in your story, and that connection carries weight. Trying to appear flawless may win applause, but being real is what changes lives. The world does not need more polished performances. It needs more genuine people who are not afraid to be vulnerable and honest. Living authentically also requires courage, because it often means standing alone. When you stop bending to every opinion, you will face criticism. Some people will label you as difficult, others will distance themselves because you no longer play by their rules. But that resistance is often the very evidence that you are walking in truth. If everyone applauds you, it is usually because you have compromised somewhere. But when you live with authenticity, even your critics cannot deny the strength of conviction you carry. That kind of courage comes from knowing your worth is already secured in God's love, so you do not need to buy it with people's approval. Authenticity produces freedom. You no longer waste energy trying to manage how people see you. You no longer live in fear of being found out, because what they see is what they get. That freedom allows you to put your energy into what actually matters, your calling, your relationships, your growth, rather than into keeping up appearances. Approval is exhausting because it demands constant maintenance. Authenticity is restful because it flows naturally from who you already are. Ultimately, choosing authenticity over approval is choosing purpose over popularity. Approval can be taken away as quickly as it is given, but purpose is eternal. The people who dislike you cannot cancel what God has appointed you to do. The voices that criticize you cannot silence the calling that God himself spoke over your life. When you stop chasing approval and start embracing authenticity, you step into alignment with that calling. You stop living small to fit inside someone else's box and start living bold to fill the space God created for you. That kind of life may not win you universal applause, but it will give you a deep, unshakable sense of fulfillment that no amount of approval could ever match.